crystal chandelier cast harsh shadows across Victoria Blackwell's marble dining room as 26-year-old Olivia Martinez stood frozen, holding a tray of coffee cups she'd just brought from the kitchen. The words hanging in the air between them felt like shards of glass. "A waitress who can't even serve proper coffee thinks she can raise my grandson." Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she set down the tray, each clink of porcelain against silver echoing through the suffocating silence. Victoria Blackwell, 62 years old and worth $40 million, sat regally at the head of her mahogany table, her steel-gray eyes dissecting every movement Olivia made. The older woman's Chanel suit probably cost more than Olivia made in 3 months at Murphy's Diner, and Victoria made sure everyone knew it. The mansion's breakfast room felt like a courtroom, and Olivia was clearly the defendant. James, her boyfriend of 2 years, sat uncomfortably between the two women, his trust fund guilt written across his boyish features. At 28, he'd never worked a day in his life. Yet somehow, his mother deemed him more qualified to judge parenting skills than the woman who'd been supporting herself since she was 16. Victoria's manicured fingers drummed against the table's surface as she continued her assessment. "James tells me you're pregnant. 4 months along. Is that correct?" Her tone suggested she was discussing a business merger rather than her future grandchild. The way she said pregnant made it sound like a disease. Olivia straightened her shoulders, a gesture she'd perfected during countless shifts dealing with difficult customers. Working at Murphy's Diner for the past 8 years had taught her to read people, to anticipate their needs, to diffuse tension before it exploded. But Victoria Blackwell was unlike any customer she'd ever served. This woman wielded her wealth like a weapon, and she'd already decided that Olivia was unworthy of joining her family. The morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated the vast difference between their worlds. Victoria's breakfast room was larger than Olivia's entire apartment, filled with art pieces that cost more than most people's homes. The irony wasn't lost on Olivia that she was serving coffee in a house where the coffee machine probably cost more than her monthly rent. James finally found his voice, though it came out weaker than either woman would have liked. "Mom, we've talked about this. Olivia and I love each other, and we're going to make this work." His words carried the conviction of a man who'd never had to fight for anything in his life. He meant well. But his privilege made him naive to the battle being waged right in front of him. Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Love? Darling, love doesn't pay for private schools or trust funds. Love doesn't ensure my grandchild will have the opportunities that our family name provides." She turned her attention back to Olivia, her gaze like a surgeon's scalpel. "What exactly do you plan to offer my grandchild? Late nights at the diner? Hand-me-down clothes? A 1-bedroom apartment in that questionable neighborhood?" The attack was personal and calculated, designed to remind Olivia of her place in the social hierarchy. But something in Victoria's tone suggested this wasn't just about money or status. There was something deeper driving her hostility, a fear that went beyond simple class prejudice. Olivia had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until she aged out of the system. She'd learned early that family wasn't about blood or money, it was about showing up, about caring when things got difficult, about love that didn't come with conditions. She'd worked double shifts to put herself through community college, studying child development between orders because she'd always dreamed of having a family of her own. The baby growing inside her was unplanned but deeply wanted. She'd felt its first movements just last week, tiny flutters that filled her with a fierce protectiveness she'd never experienced before. This child would know stability, would know unconditional love, would never wonder if they were wanted. Olivia was determined to break the cycle of abandonment that had defined her own childhood. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I've made arrangements for you to stay here for the next month." Consider it a trial period. Her smile was predatory. If you can prove to me that you're capable of providing the kind of life my grandchild deserves, then we'll discuss your future in this family. If you can, single quotes, T. She left the threat hanging in the air like smoke. The proposal caught both Olivia and James off guard. A month in this mansion would mean taking leave from the diner, something she couldn't afford. But refusing would likely mean losing James forever, and worse. It would mean their child growing up without a father's family. Victoria's eyes glittered with satisfaction at Olivia's obvious discomfort. Of course, if you're not confident in your abilities, I completely understand. Motherhood is a tremendous responsibility, one that requires more than good intentions and dinner recipes. Olivia's small suitcase looked pathetically out of place in the marble-floored guest wing of the Blackwell mansion. The bedroom assigned to her was larger than most people's living rooms, complete with a walk-in closet that could house a small family and a bathroom with gold fixtures that probably cost more than her annual salary. But the luxury felt cold, unwelcoming, like a beautiful prison designed to remind her that she didn't belong. The first week passed in a series of calculated tests disguised as family activities. Victoria scheduled charity luncheons where Olivia was expected to make conversation with women who measured worth in stock portfolios and summer home locations. The older woman watched with hawk-like intensity as Olivia fumbled through discussions about galas and foundation boards, subjects as foreign to her as quantum physics. During these gatherings, Olivia noticed things that the other women missed. Mrs. Henderson's trembling hands suggested Parkinson's, though she was clearly trying to hide it. Young Mrs. Ashford kept excusing herself to the bathroom, displaying classic signs of morning sickness despite announcing her pregnancy. Mrs. Carrington's youngest daughter, who accompanied her mother to the lunch, showed signs of anxiety that reminded Olivia of children she'd seen in the foster system. But when Olivia gently suggested that Mrs. Henderson might benefit from using both hands to steady her teacup, or offered Mrs. Ashford some of the ginger candy she kept for her own morning sickness, Victoria's disapproval was swift and sharp. "A lady doesn't offer unsolicited advice," she whispered harshly during a private moment in the powder room. The mansion's staff seemed caught between sympathy for Olivia and loyalty to their employer. Maria, the head housekeeper who'd worked for the Blackwell family for 15 years, offered cautious smiles and occasionally left extra towels in Olivia's room. But even her kindness came with boundaries, invisible lines that reminded Olivia she was a temporary guest at best. James tried to be supportive, but his efforts often made things worse. He would attempt to defend Olivia during his mother's more pointed criticisms, but his arguments relied on generalities about love conquering all rather than specific examples of Olivia's capabilities. His heart was in the right place, but his privileged upbringing had left him unprepared for the kind of psychological warfare his mother specialized in. During the second week, Victoria introduced a new element to her testing: childcare scenarios. She arranged for her friends' grandchildren to visit, children ranging from toddlers to preteens, each presenting different challenges. "Since you claim to understand children so well, this should be easy for you," Victoria announced, her tone suggesting she expected Olivia to fail spectacularly. The children arrived like a small army of chaos, their energy filling the usually pristine mansion with noise and laughter. 7-year-old Emma was shy and clingy, having recently lost her grandfather. 10-year-old Marcus was acting out, displaying the kind of anger that masked deeper hurt. 3-year-old Sophie was in the middle of potty training and prone to dramatic meltdowns when things didn't go her way. Victoria retreated to her study, claiming important phone calls, but Olivia could see her watching through the glass doors. The older woman's expression suggested she was waiting for disaster, probably hoping for it. James offered to help but was quickly dismissed by his mother, who insisted this was Olivia's test to take alone. What followed was controlled chaos. but Olivia found herself in her element. Years of working in the diner during breakfast rushes had taught her to multitask under pressure, to anticipate needs before they became problems, to find calm in the storm. More importantly, her own childhood experiences had given her insight into what children really needed when they were struggling. She recognized Emma's withdrawal as grief processing and gave the little girl space while remaining nearby, available but not pushy. When Emma finally approached, drawn by Olivia's calm presence, they spent an hour building a blanket fort where Emma could talk about missing her grandpa without feeling pressured to be strong. Marcus's defiance reminded Olivia of herself at that age, angry at a world that seemed fundamentally unfair. Instead of trying to control his behavior, she channeled his energy into helping her organize a treasure hunt for the younger children. Giving him responsibility and treating him as capable rather than problematic transformed his attitude within hours. Sophie's meltdowns were handled with the patience of someone who understood that toddlers weren't miniature adults capable of rational thought. Olivia remained calm during the storms, offering comfort without giving in to unreasonable demands, helping Sophie learn to express her feelings with words instead of screams. By the end of the day, all three children were begging to know when they could come back to play with Olivia. Emma had fallen asleep curled against her side. Marcus was showing her his collection of baseball cards, and Sophie was proudly demonstrating her potty training progress to anyone who would listen. Victoria's expression when she emerged from her study was unreadable, but Olivia caught a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or possibly annoyance, that her test had been passed so successfully. That evening at dinner, the conversation was more strained than usual. Victoria's comments carried an edge of frustration, as if Olivia's competence was personally offensive to her. "Childcare is more than just keeping children entertained for an afternoon," she said, cutting her filet mignon with surgical precision. "Real parenting requires consistency, discipline, the ability to make difficult decisions." The implication was clear. Victoria was moving the goalposts, preparing for the next phase of her testing. Olivia realized with growing certainty that this wasn't really about proving her worthiness as a mother. This was about something deeper, something that had nothing to do with her qualifications and everything to do with Victoria's need to maintain control over her family. The morning of the third week brought an unexpected complication that would test everyone's assumptions about family, loyalty, and what it meant to truly care for a child. Olivia was in the mansion's library, reading a book on child development, when James burst through the doors with a phone clutched in his white-knuckled grip. His face was pale, his usual casual confidence replaced by raw panic. "It's Emma," he said, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Patterson just called. Emma's in the hospital. She collapsed at school and they can't figure out what's wrong. They're running tests, but ... He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Olivia had learned meant he was overwhelmed. "Mom's friend is flying back from Europe, but that's going to take 12 hours. Emma's asking for you." The request hit Olivia like a physical blow. A 7-year-old girl, already dealing with grief over her grandfather's death, was now facing a medical crisis. The child who had spent hours curled against Olivia's side building blanket forts was alone in a hospital, scared and asking for someone who was essentially a stranger. Victoria appeared in the doorway, having overheard the conversation. Her expression was carefully controlled, but Olivia caught the flicker of genuine concern in her eyes before the mask slipped back into place. "I'll handle this," Victoria announced, reaching for her purse. "I know the family, and I have connections at the hospital. This is clearly a situation that requires ... double quotes." She paused, searching for the right words. "Experience with these matters." But James was already shaking his head. "Emma specifically asked for Olivia. She won't even talk to the doctors. They said she just keeps asking when the nice lady who understands is coming back. His eyes met Olivia's across the room. She trusts you in a way she doesn't trust anyone else right now. The weight of that trust was overwhelming. Olivia had spent years serving people, anticipating their needs, providing comfort in small ways. But this was different. This was a child in crisis, a child who somehow saw something in her that even Olivia wasn't sure existed. The responsibility felt immense, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. Victoria's carefully maintained composure began to crack. This is exactly what I've been trying to explain. Childcare isn't a game or a temporary arrangement. When children are in crisis, they need stability. They need people with resources and connections. They need ... Her voice trailed off as she realized the flaw in her own argument. Emma wasn't asking for resources or connections. She was asking for comfort, for someone who had shown her genuine care without conditions. The drive to the hospital passed in tense silence. Victoria sat in the front seat of her Mercedes, her fingers drumming against her Hermes bag in a rhythm that betrayed her anxiety. James drove with the focused intensity of someone trying to outrun their own helplessness. Olivia sat in the back, her mind racing through everything she knew about Emma, everything she'd observed about the little girl's needs and fears. The pediatric ward at General Hospital was a controlled chaos of worried parents, overworked nurses, and the particular kind of institutional calm that hospitals specialized in. Emma's room was at the end of a long corridor painted in cheerful colors that couldn't quite hide the underlying tension of childhood illness and parental fear. When they arrived, Emma was curled in a hospital bed that made her look even smaller than her 7 years. Her face was pale against the white pillows, 4 tubes snaking from her small arms to machines that beeped with reassuring regularity. But her eyes, when they found Olivia in the doorway, lit up with relief so profound it made Olivia's chest tighten. The simple faith in those words broke something open in Olivia's chest. She moved to Emma's bedside without thinking, her hand finding the little girl's forehead to check for fever, her eyes scanning the monitors with knowledge she'd gained from years of caring for herself and others when money for doctors wasn't available. Victoria watched this interaction with an expression that was becoming increasingly complex. The older woman had expected to take charge, to use her connections and authority to manage the crises. But Emma's reaction to Olivia was unmistakable, undeniable, and completely outside Victoria's ability to control or dismiss. Dr. Martinez, the attending pediatrician, entered the room with a clipboard and the kind of tired professionalism that came from too many 12-hour shifts. "The good news is that we've ruled out the most serious possibilities," she announced, her eyes moving between the adults in the room to determine who was in charge. "Emma appears to be suffering from severe anxiety manifesting in physical symptoms. Her collapse was likely a panic attack, though we're still running tests to be thorough." The diagnosis hung in the air like a challenge to everything Victoria had been arguing about qualifications and proper care. This wasn't a medical emergency that required connections or financial resources. This was a psychological crisis that required understanding, patience, and the kind of emotional intelligence that had nothing to do with bank accounts or social status. Emma's small hand found Olivia's, gripping it with the desperate strength of someone who had found an anchor in a storm. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice small but determined. "The doctors are nice, but they don't understand about the scared feelings like you do." The request was simple, but its implications were enormous. Staying meant missing work, meant potentially damaging her already fragile financial situation. But more importantly, it meant accepting a level of responsibility that went far beyond Victoria's manufactured tests. This was real, immediate, and desperately needed. Olivia looked at Victoria, expecting opposition, preparing for another battle about proper procedures and family authority. But what she saw in the older woman's face surprised her. For just a moment, Victoria's mask slipped completely, revealing something that looked almost like recognition, as if she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find. The hospital's family room at 3 in the morning was a study in exhausted desperation. Olivia had been at Emma's bedside for 18 hours straight, leaving only when the little girl finally fell into fitful sleep. Her back ached from the uncomfortable plastic chair. Her clothes were wrinkled from the previous day, and her mind was fuzzy from the combination of pregnancy hormones and sleep deprivation. Victoria sat across from her in the fluorescent-lit waiting area, looking every one of her 62 years despite her usually immaculate appearance. Her Chanel suit was rumpled, her perfect makeup had worn off hours ago, and her steel-gray hair had escaped its elegant chignon. But more telling than her disheveled appearance was the expression on her face: confusion, frustration, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. "The doctors say she can go home tomorrow if she continues to improve," Victoria said, her voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. "Mrs. Patterson will be back from Europe by then, and Emma can return to her normal routine." She paused, studying Olivia with eyes that seemed to be seeing her clearly for the first time. "She's been asking for you every time she wakes up." The simple statements carried more weight than any of Victoria's previous accusations or challenges. Emma's trust wasn't something that could be bought, manipulated, or faked. It was earned through consistent presence, through understanding that went beyond surface interactions, through the kind of authentic care that children could sense instinctively. James had been pacing the hallway for the past hour, his privileged upbringing leaving him unprepared for the harsh realities of childhood illness and family crises. He kept offering to call people, to use family connections, to throw money at problems that couldn't be solved with wealth or influence. His helplessness was almost painful to watch. A grown man reduced to boyish anxiety by situations that required emotional maturity rather than trust fund solutions. Dr. Martinez returned with Emma's latest test results, her professional demeanor softened by exhaustion and genuine concern for her small patient. "Physically, Emma is fine. The blood work came back normal, the cardiac tests show no abnormalities, and her vital signs have stabilized." She sat down across from the small group, her expression growing more serious. But psychologically, she's struggling with complex grief compounded by separation anxiety. The loss of her grandfather has left her feeling unsafe, and that manifests as physical symptoms when she's stressed. Victoria's face tightened at the diagnosis, but not with the dismissive expression Olivia had come to expect. Instead, she looked almost stricken, as if the doctor's words had struck something deep and painful. "What kind of treatment does she need?" Victoria asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Consistency, patience, and adults who understand that her fears are real even if they seem irrational," Dr. Martinez replied. "She needs people who can provide emotional safety without making her feel broken or wrong for struggling." The doctor's eyes moved to Olivia. "She's responded remarkably well to your presence. Children her age often fixate on adults who make them feel genuinely understood." The medical validation of Olivia's instincts should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt like an enormous responsibility. Emma wasn't just a test case in Victoria's elaborate evaluation. She was a real child with real trauma who had somehow decided that Olivia was safe. That trust came with obligations that extended far beyond proving worthiness to a judgmental mother-in-law. When they returned to Emma's room, the little girl was awake and clearly anxious about being alone. Her face brightened when she saw Olivia, but there was still fear in her eyes. The kind of deep-seated worry that came from having lost someone important and learning that people could disappear without warning. "Are you going to leave now?" Emma asked, her small voice carrying the weight of previous abandonment. "Everyone always leaves when I start feeling better." The question hit Olivia like a physical blow, revealing the depth of Emma's trauma and the significance of her request for Olivia to stay. This wasn't just about comfort during a medical crisis. It was about consistency, about proving that some adults could be trusted to remain present even when things got difficult. Victoria, who had been observing this interaction from the doorway, stepped into the room with an expression that was becoming increasingly complex. "Emma, sweetheart, your grandmother will be back tomorrow, and you'll be able to go home to your own room, your own things." But Emma shook her head, her grip on Olivia's hand tightening. "I want to stay with the lady who understands the scared feelings. She knows how to make them smaller." Her eyes moved between the adults in the room, confusion evident in her young features. "Why can't I stay with her?" The innocent question exposed the artificial nature of the boundaries that adults created around family, care, and belonging. Emma didn't understand social hierarchies or financial qualifications for love. She only knew that Olivia had provided something she desperately needed: understanding without judgment, presence without conditions, safety without demands for her to be anything other than exactly who she was. Victoria's carefully constructed arguments about proper care and appropriate resources crumbled in the face of a 7-year-old's simple logic. Emma wasn't asking for material possessions or social advantages. She was asking for emotional security. For someone who had proven capable of seeing her pain and responding with authentic compassion, the silence in the room stretched uncomfortably as everyone processed the implications of Emma's request. James looked helplessly between his mother and his girlfriend, clearly wanting to support Olivia but lacking the courage to directly challenge his mother's authority. Victoria stared at Emma with an expression that seemed to be wrestling with competing impulses. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "Emma, this lady has her own life, her own responsibilities. She can't just change everything because you're scared." But Emma's response was immediate and devastating in its clarity. "She already did change everything. She stayed when I was scared, and she didn't get mad when I cried. And she helped me understand that missing Grandpa doesn't mean I'm broken." Tears began streaming down her face. "Why doesn't that matter?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, challenging every assumption Victoria had made about worth, value, and what qualified someone to care for a child. Emma's tears weren't manipulative or calculated. They were the honest expression of a child who had found safety and couldn't understand why that safety was being deemed insufficient by the adults around her. Victoria stood at Emma's bedside, her usually impeccable composure cracking like ice under pressure. For the first time since Olivia had known her, the older woman looked truly uncertain, as if the foundations of her carefully constructed worldview were shifting beneath her feet. Emma's innocent question about why authentic care didn't matter had exposed something raw and painful that Victoria had been trying to hide behind wealth and social positioning. "Emma needs to be discharged properly," Victoria said finally, her voice lacking its usual authority. "There are procedures. Insurance matters to handle." But even as she spoke, her eyes kept returning to the sight of Emma clinging to Olivia's hand with the desperation of someone who had found an anchor in a storm. Dr. Martinez re-entered the room with discharge papers and the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of navigating family dynamics in crisis situations. "Emma's grandmother has been delayed another 6 hours due to flight connections," she announced, scanning her clipboard. "We can't discharge a minor without a legal guardian present, but we also can't keep her here unnecessarily." Her eyes moved meaningfully between the adults, We need to identify who has temporary custody authority. The bureaucratic reality forced a decision that emotional appeals had been dancing around. Emma couldn't be discharged to Olivia because she had no legal standing, despite being the person Emma trusted most. Victoria, as a family friend, had emergency contact status, but was clearly not Emma's preferred caregiver. James had no relationship with the child at all beyond these few chance encounters. "I'll stay until Mrs. Patterson arrives," Victoria announced, but her words lacked conviction. They all knew that Emma's anxiety would likely spike again if left with someone who felt like a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned. Emma, despite being only 7 years old, seemed to understand the adult complications swirling around her. "I'll be good," she said quietly, her voice carrying the heartbreaking resignation of a child who had learned that her needs often came second to adult conveniences. "I won't cry if she has to leave." The promise was devastating in its maturity, revealing how much Emma had already learned about managing adult discomfort with her emotions. She was offering to suppress her fear, to make herself smaller and more convenient. Because she'd learned that expressing her genuine needs made grown-ups uncomfortable. Olivia felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with Victoria's tests or proving worthiness. This was about a scared little girl who deserved better than having to manage adult anxieties on top of her own trauma. The baby growing inside her seemed to flutter with agreement, as if already understanding that family was about showing up when it mattered. Not about meeting arbitrary social requirements. "What if I stayed too?" Olivia asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "Just until her grandmother arrives. Emma wouldn't be alone, and Mrs. Blackwell would be the official guardian for discharge purposes." Victoria's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, calculation, and something that might have been relief. The proposal solved multiple problems while forcing them to work together rather than in opposition. More importantly, it put Emma's immediate needs first, which seemed to be a novel concept in Victoria's usual approach to problem-solving. But before Victoria could respond, Emma's small voice cut through the tension. "Would you both stay? Like a family stays?" Her question revealed the depth of her longing for stability. For adults who could cooperate in caring for her rather than fighting over authority and control, the request forced them all to confront what family actually meant versus what they had been assuming it should look like. Emma wasn't asking for biological relationships or legal documents. She was asking for functional cooperation, for adults who could put her needs ahead of their own conflicts. Dr. Martinez watched this exchange with the clinical interest of someone who had seen many family dynamics play out in hospital rooms. From a medical standpoint, Emma's anxiety decreases significantly when she feels secure about adult consistency. If you're both willing to stay until her grandmother arrives, that would likely be the best outcome for her recovery. The medical endorsement created space for cooperation without either woman having to admit defeat or change their fundamental positions. Victoria could agree to stay without acknowledging that Olivia's presence was essential. Olivia could remain without feeling like she was imposing or overstepping boundaries. As evenings settled over the hospital, an unexpected routine developed. Victoria handled the practical matters with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. Coordinating with insurance companies, ensuring proper meal arrangements, communicating with Emma's grandmother about flight delays and arrival times. Meanwhile, Olivia focused on Emma's emotional needs with the intuitive understanding that had drawn the child to her initially. She helped Emma process her fears about her grandfather's death, validated her anxiety about being left alone, and created small moments of normalcy within the institutional setting of the hospital. What surprised everyone, including Victoria herself, was how naturally they fell into complementary roles. Victoria's organizational skills and resources handled the external pressures that could have made the situation more stressful. Olivia's emotional intelligence and natural empathy addressed Emma's internal struggles with patience and understanding. Emma seemed to recognize this partnership instinctively, asking Victoria questions about practical matters while turning to Olivia for comfort and emotional support. The child's natural wisdom in utilizing both women's strengths created a template for cooperation that neither adult had anticipated. By 10 o'clock that evening, Emma was finally sleeping peacefully, her small hand still clutching Olivia's fingers, but her breathing deep and regular for the first time in days. The crisis seemed to be genuinely passing, not through medical intervention or adult authority, but through the simple provision of consistent, caring presence. Victoria stood at the foot of Emma's bed, studying the sleeping child with an expression that was becoming increasingly thoughtful. "She hasn't slept this well since before her grandfather died," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested she was beginning to understand something important about the nature of care and comfort. At 11:30 that night, Emma was sleeping soundly for the first time in days when Mrs. Patterson finally arrived from Europe. Exhausted and frantic with worry, she burst into the hospital room like a hurricane of maternal anxiety, her designer luggage forgotten in the hallway as she rushed to her granddaughter's bedside. "Oh, my darling girl," Mrs. Patterson whispered, tears streaming down her face as she saw Emma's peaceful expression. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I should never have left, especially so soon after losing Grandpa." Her guilt was palpable. The kind of self-recrimination that came from loving someone deeply and feeling like you'd failed them at a crucial moment. What happened next surprised everyone, including Emma herself. When the little girl woke to find her grandmother there, her first reaction wasn't relief or joy, but anxiety about the adults who had been caring for her. "Where's Olivia?" she asked immediately, her eyes scanning the room with the kind of panic that comes from having people disappear without explanation. "I'm right here, sweetheart," Olivia said softly, moving back into Emma's line of sight. "I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye." But Emma's response revealed the depth of her attachment and the complexity of her healing process. "Can't you come home with us?" "Grandma, she knows how to make the scared feelings smaller. And she understands about missing people." Her young voice carried a desperation that made all the adults in the room uncomfortable. Mrs. Patterson looked between Olivia and Victoria with obvious confusion, trying to understand the dynamics that had developed during her absence. "Emma, sweetheart, this nice lady has her own family to take care of. We can't just ask her to come live with us." The gentle rejection sent Emma into the kind of meltdown that came from exhaustion, medical stress, and the realization that the safety she'd found was temporary. "But she's the only one who understands," Emma sobbed, her small body shaking with the force of her emotions. "Everyone else just wants me to stop being sad, but she knows that the sad has to come out before it can get smaller." Olivia's explanation to Emma about grief processing had clearly resonated deeply, providing the child with a framework for understanding her emotions that no adult had offered before. Emma wasn't just crying because she was tired or overwhelmed. She was grieving the loss of someone who had finally helped her make sense of her own pain. Victoria watched this scene unfold with an expression that was rapidly evolving from confusion to recognition, to something approaching awe. For the first time, she was seeing the full scope of what Olivia had provided. Not just childcare or companionship, but genuine emotional intelligence applied to a child's healing process. Dr. Martinez entered the room to handle discharge paperwork, but she immediately assessed the emotional crisis unfolding in front of her. "What's happening here isn't unusual," she said gently, addressing Mrs. Patterson. "Emma has formed an attachment to someone who helped her through trauma. Transitioning away from that support can be difficult. But then, Dr. Martinez did something unexpected. She turned to Olivia with the kind of professional interest that suggested she was seeing something significant. "You mentioned earlier that you studied child development. Where did you get your training?" The question caught everyone off guard, including Olivia herself. It was the first time anyone had inquired about her background beyond her current job as a waitress. "I was pre-med with a focus on pediatric psychology," Olivia said quietly. "I completed 3 years before financial circumstances forced me to leave school." The revelation hung in the air like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and something that might have been embarrassment. For weeks, she had been treating Olivia as an unqualified interloper, dismissing her insights and questioning her capabilities, when in fact Olivia had more relevant education than anyone else in the room. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Victoria asked, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure, while her worldview rearranged itself around this new information. Olivia's laugh was bitter and tired. "Because you never asked about my qualifications. You only asked about my job, my income, my neighborhood. You assumed that serving coffee meant I was incapable of understanding anything else." The accusation was delivered without malice, but with devastating accuracy. Victoria had indeed made assumptions based on social class and current employment, never bothering to investigate the person behind the uniform. Her prejudice had blinded her to exactly the kind of credentials she claimed to value. Mrs. Patterson, who had been following this exchange with growing interest, suddenly spoke up. "You're trained in pediatric psychology?" When Olivia nodded, she continued, "Emma's been seeing a therapist since her grandfather died, but she won't open up to him. She just sits there in silence for the full hour." Her eyes moved to Emma, who had calmed down and was listening intently to the adult conversation. "But she's told you things she hasn't told anyone else." The implications were becoming clear to everyone except Victoria, who seemed to be struggling with the collision between her assumptions and reality. Emma's instinctive trust in Olivia wasn't random or misplaced. It was the recognition of genuine expertise combined with authentic caring. Emma, with the directness that only children possessed, looked straight at Victoria and asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Why were you mean to her if she's smart about helping kids feel better?" The innocent inquiry forced Victoria to confront the ugliness of her own behavior in terms a child could understand. She had been cruel to someone who possessed exactly the qualifications she claimed to want for her grandchild's care. Simply because those qualifications came packaged in a way that didn't match her social expectations, Dr. Martinez seized the moment to address the larger issue. Emma needs consistent support during her grief process. The attachment she's formed represents genuine progress in her healing. She looked directly at Mrs. Patterson. If there's any way to maintain that therapeutic relationship, even temporarily, it could be crucial for her recovery. The suggestion hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds: the practical reality of Emma's needs and the social complexities that had been preventing those needs from being met. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, there was a possibility that authentic care might trump arbitrary social requirements. 6 weeks later, Olivia stood in the doorway of the Blackwell Mansion's library, watching Victoria read to Emma from a book about grief and healing that Olivia had recommended. The sight would have been unimaginable just 2 months earlier, the imperious millionaire sitting cross-legged on the floor, her voice gentle and patient as she helped a 7-year-old process complex emotions about loss and family. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Victoria's recognition of her own prejudice had been painful and gradual, forced by the undeniable evidence of Emma's continued improvement under Olivia's guidance. Mrs. Patterson had asked Olivia to continue working with Emma as an informal therapeutic support, an arrangement that required Victoria to witness daily proof of capabilities she had dismissed so thoroughly. The mansion itself had changed too. Where once it had felt like a museum designed to intimidate, it now showed signs of actual life being lived within its walls. Emma's artwork decorated the refrigerator in the kitchen, alongside ultrasound photos of Olivia's baby that Victoria had surprisingly requested copies of. The formal dining room had been abandoned in favor of breakfast nook meals where conversation was encouraged rather than controlled. James had found his courage somewhere in the midst of watching his mother's worldview crack open and rebuild itself around evidence rather than assumption. He'd started working part-time at a nonprofit that provided educational support for foster children. His privileged guilt finally channeled into something productive rather than paralyzing. But the most significant change was in Victoria herself. The woman who had spent weeks trying to prove Olivia unworthy was now her fiercest advocate, having seen firsthand the difference between surface qualifications and genuine capability. Victoria's business contacts had helped Olivia find a part-time position at a pediatric clinic that would allow her to complete her degree while working. Her financial support making it possible for Olivia to leave the diner without losing her apartment. The baby, now in Olivia's 7th month, seemed to approve of these developments with increasingly active movements that often caught Victoria's attention during their conversations. The older woman had surprised everyone, including herself, by requesting to feel the baby kick, her face softening into an expression of wonder that revealed the grandmother she was capable of being when her defenses weren't raised. Emma had become a regular presence in their lives, spending weekends at the mansion and maintaining weekly sessions with Olivia that her grandmother credited with remarkable improvement in the child's emotional stability. The little girl had also appointed herself as the unborn baby's protector, frequently putting her hand on Olivia's belly and whispering promises about all the fun they would have together. On this particular afternoon, Victoria stood up from her reading session with Emma and approached Olivia with an expression that was becoming familiar. The look of someone who wanted to say something important but wasn't quite sure how to begin. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I've already said," Victoria began, her voice carrying none of the imperious tone that had characterized their early interactions. "I spent so much time worried about whether you were good enough for my family that I never asked whether my family was good enough for you." The admission represented a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Victoria was acknowledging that worth flowed in both directions, that Olivia brought value that couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or social connections. Emma looked up from her book with the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing adults finally understand something she had known all along. "I told you she was smart about feelings," she said matter-of-factly. "Some people just take longer to notice smart that doesn't look the way they expect." The child's wisdom, delivered with 7-year-old directness, made both women laugh in a way that would have been impossible during their first meeting. Emma had become the bridge between their worlds, proving that family could be chosen and built rather than simply inherited or earned through qualification tests. As evening approached, they gathered for dinner in the breakfast nook that had become their informal family space. James served a meal he had actually cooked himself, proud of skills he was still developing. Emma chattered about her day at school and her plans for teaching the baby about butterflies. Victoria shared stories from her own childhood that revealed vulnerabilities she had previously hidden behind wealth and status. And Olivia, her hand resting on her growing belly, felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. Not because she had passed someone else's tests, but because she had remained true to herself while others learned to see clearly. The baby kicked as if in agreement, already part of a family that was defined by love, presence, and the kind of understanding that couldn't be bought but had to be earned through authentic care. As they cleared the dishes together, Victoria made one final observation that seemed to summarize everything they had learned. I spent so much time trying to protect my family from the wrong people that I almost kept out exactly the right person. She looked at Olivia with genuine warmth. Thank goodness children are smarter than we are sometimes, Emma. Never one to let adults have the last word, piped up with characteristic confidence. That's why the baby will be lucky. It gets to have all of us from the very beginning. Her simple statement carried the weight of truth. This child would grow up surrounded by adults who had learned that family was about showing up, understanding, and loving without conditions. The mansion that had once felt like a fortress designed to keep people out had transformed into a home designed to welcome the right people in. And as Olivia felt her baby moving restlessly, as if eager to join this unexpected family, she knew that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that changed everyone involved for the better.